If your team's trying to move faster with AI or scale more efficiently without reinventing the wheel, InfoQ Dev Summit Munich 2025 this October 15 to 16 might help. It's a practical event. Talks from people in the trenches, sharing what they've actually shipped, fixed, or learned. No big launches or buzzwords, just useful ideas you can take back to your team the next day. Learn more at devsummit.infoq.com.
Good day, folks. This is Shane Hasty for the InfoQ Engineering Culture Podcast. Today, I get the privilege to sit down and chat with Tara Hernandez. Tara, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
So my starting point for these conversations is, who's Tara?
Oh, gosh, how much time do we have for that? I have spent my career over 30 years now, primarily focused on helping organizations evolve how they develop software. All the way back to my very earliest days at Netscape Communications Corporation, where we invented the earliest web-based developer tools, through today, where I'm now at MongoDB, and I run an organization of developers who do all that work for me. Now I just organize them.
We were chatting earlier, and you made the point, you really don't like technology.
I think there's a tendency to over-index on technology, right? Some people, talk about how when they're not at work, they spent their weekends investigating some new thing on the computer. And I'm like, oh, please go ride a bike, pick up a game, walk your dog, something. Technology to me is a means to an end, right? But ultimately, as an industry, I think we're in the business of solving interesting problems. And the technology that we use to solve those problems has and will change dramatically, and sometimes quite swiftly. I feel like the rate of change in some ways just continuously gets faster and faster. So getting attached to one particular technology is, I think, a good way to paint yourself into a corner, right? We always need to think about the adaptation of those emerging technologies and think about, is it about the technology or is it about the problem we're trying to solve? Because at the end of the day, I think the problem we're trying to solve is the most interesting challenge. And sometimes it's not a technical problem. So
we're in the Engineering Culture Podcast. Culture is something that we, again, from our conversation earlier, we both care deeply about. But what makes a good engineering culture?
That's a fantastic question. So I'm a bit of a DevOps nerd, and I always loved how Jez Humble described DevOps as a community of practice, right? It's not a tool or a set of tools. It's an agreement to have a shared ownership to a good business outcome, right? And if you build out from that, you can kind of extrapolate and think about a good culture is one that enables every member of the team to have the ability to share in the ownership of the final outcome, right? And to feel empowered to contribute to it in a very real and tangible way, right? In the book Accelerate, Jez and Nicole Forsgren and Gene Kim, they talked about, the capabilities that describe elite organizations. And they introduced a lot of us to the concept of Westrum's culture hierarchies, right? And so this concept of a generative culture that I think is so incredible because it honors the individual and the value that they can bring, right? And I really believe in that. I believe that a good culture fosters better outcomes, business outcomes, right? And if you read some of my blog posts and writings, you'll also know that a good culture is also a diverse culture as far as, backgrounds, educational histories, all the different types of ways that people's experience can contribute to this idea of shared experience leading to innovation, right? It's always an interesting challenge to me to see where does a team struggle. And part of it could be, do they have the right tools that they need? But part of it could be do they have the right environment to thrive, right? And I think both of those, from my perspective, are the responsibility of the leadership of that organization. So, you were asking me earlier, what's my biggest passion? And it really is about facilitating good leadership development within that organization as part of that cultural evolution. So if there's a problem, people feel empowered to fix it. If there's an idea, people feel able to explore it.
But leadership development, there is a stereotype, and we do it, and it exists because it happens. We take the best technologist, we tell them you're now going to lead a team, and we give them absolutely no guidance on what this new job is. How do we develop good leaders?
Oh my goodness. I have so many thoughts about this. You're right. It is so prevalent. We think someone is a stupendous developer. Clearly they must be put in charge, right? And full disclosure, I became a manager quite early in my career. I was still at Netscape. I think I was, the ripe old age of 26. And someone decided, we'll put her in charge, the fools. But I loved it. I found that I loved it more than anything else because I found my greatest satisfaction in defining my success through the success of those who work for me, right? And so when people tell me that they wanted to get into management, that's the first thing I ask them. Why do you want to get into management? In a lot of cases, they think it's because they think that is the easier path to promotion, right? And so we talk about that. And I've talked many people out of going into people management for that reason. And in fact, I take that as a signal that we have not done our due diligence as an organization to provide good career paths for the individual contributors. But, going back to your original question of, how do we develop leadership skills for people who are put in a leadership position? I think, we do have to quickly answer, is this actually the right thing for that person, first of all? And if the answer is yes, and they say, yeah, I really love coaching, right? That's a very good way to get started, right? I love the concept of mentoring. Maybe they had interns that they worked with. That's a good answer. Another good answer is, I want to be able to have more influence in what happens to my team. That was actually my answer. And I think those are all good reasons to get into leadership. And then you absolutely must invest, right? When I was at Netscape, I actually was sent to a 2-week course with 3-ring binders, the whole thing. And that was the last time I ever saw anything like that happen. Most companies might have some kind of learning and development video course that you might watch, but that's kind of about it, right? And so I think, again, as senior leaders, then we have to be on the lookout. If we've recently put someone in a new management role, how are we supporting them? Do they have a mentor? Do they have clarity about what the expectations are? Do they get reminded on the regular about what expectations have changed? Do they understand that rather than being, perhaps in many cases, the one who implemented the most features and fixed the most bugs, and now they need to be the one who enables that in their reports? Right. And some people discover, wow, I hate that. In fact, I have someone right now who is, I think, coming to that realization and may decide to go back. Right. Charity Majors, if you're familiar with her, she writes a great blog on leadership, and she has that whole concept of the engineering pendulum, which I love. Right. I think people can and should go back and forth. Sometimes they want to do it, sometimes they don't. And I think that should be also a supported thing. Another aspect of good culture is to not put people in a box. Right. That variability, that flexibility, that agency can extend to role. It can extend to organizational structure and the whole 9 yards. But I think that the other most important thing about the development of people management in leadership roles is that it's not a point in time. There's no point when all of a sudden you're done. You know everything. Right. It's recognizing that it's an endless cycle of learning, and you'll do well and you'll do poorly, and you just have to learn from doing poorly and build on doing well, and have an environment around you that recognizes that process and doesn't overly penalize you for it.
How do we create that environment?
It starts at the top. In most cases, I think culture should be bottoms up because it can't be imposed. But a value proposition around leadership has to be led from the front. If the CEO is saying, yes, we have a good culture, all of these things, but is seen to be punitive and angry and, all the things that are negative, and holding people accountable in ways that are disrespectful or otherwise negative, the culture doesn't persist, right? You have to reward it and incentivize it at all levels. I'm a vice president. I've been doing this for 30 years. I make plenty of mistakes, right? I could not be successful at my job if I didn't give myself grace and I didn't work in an organization where I was given grace. Right now, that's different than perpetually being incompetent, right? I also expect and should be held to a very high bar of accountability and performance. But going back to Westrom's generative culture, right? Mistakes are not the death penalty. Mistakes are learned from, right? I think it's true for projects. If you do as any good organization, I think, should do and have things like blameless postmortems, right? That's also true for people. The very important difference, of course, is there's a difference between screwing up software and screwing up a human, right? So I think that they're not exactly equivalent, but a good culture recognizes and can be safely forgiving of mistakes versus a culture where, HR is the enemy, the managers are the enemy, us, them, every man for himself, so to speak. Those are terrible, and those businesses will not succeed, in my opinion. I think there's some data, but I can't quote you right off the top of my head.
One of the things that we do see is organizations want to adopt new technologies, new ways of working. And the knee-jerk reaction to this sort of modernization is to go and hire. And often the incumbents are left behind.
I think there is just an element of human nature that we come to understand something, and then that understanding has a hard time evolving. And it's interesting because at the same time, I've seen this many times in senior leadership at companies, we also tend to think of our engineering organizations, our employees, as interchangeable, which is sort of in conflict of that. So both of them are not ideal. But I think that part of what it means to give agency and to empower and promote the concept of a shared ownership to a common outcome is to invest, right? Particularly in your high performers, and to give them the opportunity to grow their skill sets, presumably because they've proved that they can, right? Here at MongoDB, MongoDB has been around for a while. The core database is in C++. The number of companies that work in C++ is steadily going down. At some point, we may decide we want to do Rust, or we want to do a language that somebody hasn't fully produced yet. And it is completely, I think, reasonable, even if that time is not now, that we would give space for some of our performers, especially our top performers, to go experiment. Right? At Google, you call it a 20% project, perhaps, to go do an experimentation for a product. But I think even doing experimentation for skills growth, this is something that I've done, certainly, when containers were starting to become a thing. I was like, well, who knows anything about containers? Not much. Let's go figure it out, right? AI is another one. Who knows anything about AI? Well, not much. Let's go figure it out. I think the AI thing has the added difficulty, though, where there's so much hype around it and so many people saying very ridiculous things like, oh, well, you'll never need software developers again if you just use our AI agents. And I don't think that incentivizes some, suspicious developers to want to participate, which is unfortunate. But it's, again, humans are humans, right? And our business as people managers and as leaders is to recognize that fact and then figure out how to build on it, because humans are also ambitious or motivated or curious or any of these other things that could really lend them to taking opportunities and just going crazy with them. And I think that's the thing that you really want to inspire, right? Because they could turn around. I don't know. Somebody right now might be thinking, gosh, I think we could take this module out of the core database and replace it with Rust and get a 40% performance intake, right? No leader worth their salt is going to say that's a terrible idea. Why would you waste your time on that, right? We want people to think about things like that.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier on is the more diverse the team, the better the outcomes. And yeah, there are studies that have definitely shown that. It also is hard to create that diversity, or it can be hard to create that diversity.
It absolutely can. And it has been so politicized, especially in the United States, where the idea of diversity is equated with underqualified. And I will not go down that path. I will not bore you with my rants there. But I will say that studies going back to, I think the seminal McKinsey study was back in 2012, right? Over a decade ago. And, Boston Consulting and Google, it's actually did studies about this. So many studies have proved this over and over again, that a diverse employee base that is supported by an inclusive culture. Now, that's a really important concept. We talk about diversity and inclusion, and there's many phrases around it. Diversity is asking everybody to the dance, but inclusion is asking them to dance, right? Is one fun way I've heard it described. But think about an example of a diverse employee base could include retired members of the armed forces. If I have a team that is struggling to get organized, they have not figured out a structure that allows them to succeed. Well, gosh, who gets a lot of very proactive, consistent training around leadership and structure? Non-coms and officers. So there's an example. If you're trying to sell into a new customer demographic, I give this example a lot. I talk about the racist soap dispenser. I don't know if you've ever seen this video. It's on YouTube. There's this poor man who has very dark skin is trying to use an automated soap dispenser to wash his hands in a bathroom. And he can't because he keeps putting his hand under it and nothing happens. And then his coworker, who happens to be Caucasian, puts his hand under and it works just fine. So eventually he gets a paper towel, a white one, and puts his hand under so he can get soap, right? It's because the sensor cannot understand dark skin. Imagine if there was one person with dark skin who tested that sensor. And then this company would not have made a product that cannot be used by billions of people. That's an example of diversity. Another example that I'm personally familiar with is virtual reality hardware. You think like an Oculus or any of the rigs, even Apple's product. I tried it. A study came out that estimated that as many as 78% of women would be subject to motion sickness because their physical structure and their physiology was just different enough that it gave them a significantly harder experience than the average man. These are examples of where diversity is fundamentally critical to your eventual success, right? All these companies made products that basically ruled out half of their potential customer base. That's not good business, right? If you're selling a lot of B2C consumer software, there's a million different demographics that could come into play, location, country, cultural norms. There was a big thing that you probably remember about how certain emojis started coming out. And in some countries, it's like, oh, that's an emoji. In other countries, like, that's a deadly insult, right? And if you don't have representatives of those cultures, you're going to make those mistakes, right? Imagine being, all Americans and trying to sell in Taipei or Japan. No company, of course, would do that now. We've learned our lesson the hard way, right? We hire local people to help us with language and culture.
Circling back around to developer trust and developer experience, how do we improve the relationships in our organizations and our teams?
Oh, gosh. There's so many answers to that. But to me, the thing that I was always reached to first is transparency, right? So my job, in my view, is to make sure that my team is crystal clear on what we need to get done, and that when we do it correctly, they are rewarded, right? And when they do it incorrectly, they are coached. And that if somebody is choosing or unable to actually do the job, then they are respectfully managed out. And feedback loops are constant and circular. I always accept feedback, right? It's that investment that you have to make every day that starts to build the human trust, right? And with the human trust, then you can start feeling more ambitious about everything else. Going back to Westrom, generative culture, now you're willing to take risks. What Google described as, psychological safety is the first of 5 key things that make for successful teams. Psychological safety is also very critical to having an inclusive culture, right? The willingness to take risks because you know that you will not be unduly penalized. And that comes through transparency and consistency. And it sounds simple and it's terribly difficult to maintain, especially one of the things I love about where I work now with MongoDB is we are still committed to our hybrid and remote workforce. The people who report up to me go from Sydney to Berlin. right? And most of them are not based in a central office. And so it is exceedingly critical that I over communicate, and I don't think I communicate enough. So this is always a challenge that I have. Am I being as transparent as I need to be? Am I passing down the information? Am I reinforcing the messages and the values that I want to make? It's something I worry about all the time. And I think any good leader should be thinking about that. You never want to take your people for granted, because then they'll notice, and then you lose that trust.
Another thing that we were chatting about before we started recording was you build it, you run it, you use it. The dog fooding approach, although I much prefer drink our own champagne to eat our own dog food.
Yeah, we've tried to use that one too. It hasn't stuck quite as much, but I think it's just because we're very rude. Eating your own pizza is another one. One of the things I really love about working at a company that makes developer tools is exactly that. My very first company was a company called Borland. It was compilers and databases, and Netscape, of course, was browsers. That was very easy to dog food. But a lot of the companies I've worked at have made products that we could use, and I think it serves two purposes. Well, maybe more than two, but definitely it serves two purposes. The first one, of course, what I think is the most important, is it helps develop customer empathy. We should be using, as much as possible, the products that our customers are using, so that we can understand what our customer pain points are. And we actually recently, one of my engineers got a blog post posted for our engineering blog talking about how the most recent version of MongoDB was, we have a proprietary continuous integration system. Don't judge us. It is purpose-built to test a distributed document database. It's very, very specialized and runs a 10 engineer years worth of compute volume of tasks every day. That's how much we test. And so it's built on top of MongoDB. It's on Atlas. And we rolled on to version 8, and we found 2 stop ship bugs on that. And because I'm like, if it's good enough for our customers, it's good enough for us, and vice versa. Right. And my engineers had previously had been as, aware of that value opportunity. But boy, man, after we found those bugs, everybody was just walking around, chest out, proud. Like, we helped the business. We did something valuable. And the other thing is, which I think is also important, but maybe a little more subtle, is it keeps the business honest. When AWS was still very early, a lot of people would ask them, a new service would come out, well, what is Amazon running on this service? Right. And for a while, the answer was not much. I think Google is rightly asked something similar. How much of Google is run on Google Cloud? How much of MongoDB is run on Atlas? I think any business that's providing those types of services should expect to be asked, right? And we should be able to provide that answer. Otherwise, what's the point, right? If you're not building something that you yourself would use, you're clearly doing something wrong. Your priorities are not correct for this category, right? Obviously, that doesn't work for. I would not personally find any use for most of Salesforce, for example. Slightly different.
What's the important question I haven't asked you?
I think the one that everybody is asking right now is, what is the future of our industry? What is the future of the world in the face of AI? Personally, I think that's giving AI a little bit too much credit, to be honest. I live on LinkedIn quite a bit. I'm always hiring, so keeping an eye out for folks. And I remember seeing some post someone shared about how Mark Andreessen, who I actually know from my Netscape days, we're not friends or anything, but he was commenting that AI is going to become so dominant that the only humans that will still need to be involved are the venture capitalists. Right? And everybody was like, "Okay, Mark." But then, not 2 days later, there was another article where a venture capital firm was using AI to do the evaluation. So if you have, AI generating the ideas and AI doing the evaluations, what's the point of humans? Right? And I think it's, that level of silliness. We can't help ourselves. We, as humans, I think, are inclined to be fascinated by the fantastical. But I do think that there's an element of, the quote that's coming to mind was from the first Jurassic Park movie. Jeff Goldblum's character was, you were so busy thinking about how you can do a thing, you never stopped to think about whether or not you should. Right now, I think a lot of people could argue dinosaurs are cool. all right, they eat a couple of people, but still dinosaurs, right? But I think there's this element of what is our purpose as an industry? What is our purpose as a human? What problems are we solving? And I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, the technology is an interesting implementation detail. If AI goes in the direction that some people say it's going to go, are we solving a problem or are we just making humans irrelevant? And in which case, your business probably isn't going to go very far. You've lost your customer base. We're all just going to be gone. So I think it's important to remember the human element. Like we talk about, those who think in these terms, the most important thing about a company is its culture, right? But you could also say, is the culture that you're facilitating through your products good? Can you be proud of it? Are you contributing to our existence, right? Are you solving amazing things? When we were at Netscape, we speculated so much about information freedom. People can know anything, anywhere, right? And then we started to realize, but what if the internet turns into TV, but worse? And well, one could argue that kind of happened. But still, I will never forget when, during the Arab Spring, people were putting the Google DNS server as graffiti on walls, 8.8.8.8, because countries were trying to shut down the internet and people bypassed it and were able to talk to each other and communicate and get information. And despite everything terrible that can happen on the internet, that I'll never forget that, because the internet, much like in many technologies, is just enabling people to be more who they are, but faster and at scale, right? And I think that ethical companies remember that and think about the products that they develop and why are they developing and what problems are they actually solving. At least I hope that they are. I like to think that we are. And others I worry about, but we can never forget. And it comes into our leadership values and how we bring up the leaders behind us. I think if we're doing it right. Now you've got me really going off on a tangent here.
Tara, a lot of deep, good conversations in here. If people want to continue the conversation, where do they find you?
Well, I definitely am on LinkedIn. I've kind of gotten off most of the other social media just because they're deadly places. I've promised myself to start writing again. I've got some blogs on Medium, mostly talking about, engineering management, leadership, and diversity and inclusion. I love doing things like this. I love nerding out with people about these types of topics, and I hope they find those as well, and maybe think about their own message, and what they bring. Because if the tech industry has taught us anything in the past decades, is that everybody has the potential of having a huge impact. A lot of it is luck, but there's a lot of really smart people who get into this space, and I think everybody has the opportunity to do something amazing, and I hope they feel the responsibility of doing it amazingly good.
Inspiring words. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you so much for having me.